The Earl of Warwick did not raise his voice. Men of his position rarely needed to. He stood in the center of the great hall of Fenwick House. His great hall, since the purchase papers had been signed in March, with his hands clasped behind him, and a look on his face that Arabella had come to recognize in 6 months of watching him. It was the look of a man disposing of something inconvenient. 8 household staff stood along the far wall. Mrs. Rowland, the housekeeper, was nearest the door. Her hands were folded in front of her apron, and she was staring at a point somewhere above Arabella's head with a precision that meant she was looking at nothing at all. "Mr. Bassett tells me," said the Earl, "that you have been in the estate office, without permission." Arabella stood very still. She was Miss Graves here. She had been Miss Graves since October, a seamstress from Halifax, hired on for the winter mending. Miss Graves did not argue with Earls. Miss Graves kept her eyes down and her voice quiet and her hands busy with other people's linen. "I was returning the account book," she said. "Mrs. Rowland asked me to bring it down from the library. Mr. Bassett says otherwise." She did not look at Bassett, who was standing to the Earl's left with an expression of patient sorrow. She had learned, in 6 months, exactly what that expression meant. "Your services," said the Earl of Warwick, "are no longer required." He reached into his coat and removed an envelope, sealed with plain red wax, and crossed the room and held it out to her. "Your wages through to the end of the month. I am told you have no family to return to in Halifax. There is a coaching inn in the village that takes in women who need lodging." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Arabella took the envelope. She held it in both hands and looked at the Earl for one long moment. This man who had lived in her grandfather's house for 9 months and did not know her name, and then she turned and walked the length of that stone floor with her chin level and her grip steady. She did not look at Mrs. Rowland. She did not look at anyone. Her room was in the north attic, the kind of room that told you everything about how a household thought of its seamstresses. Slanted ceiling, one small window, a grate that drew badly and so was rarely lit. She had counted the days in that room the same way she had once counted the rooms below. 41 days since she had found the first discrepancy in the household ledgers. 23 since she had found the second. 6 since she had identified exactly where the money was going and to whom. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the envelope. The seal was red wax, pressed flat. She had expected the Earl's signet, the double chevron she had seen on every letter that came into the house. She had not expected what she found. The seal was a ship under full sail with the initials NF, pressed below the hull. She knew that mark. She had grown up knowing it. It had been pressed into the letterhead of every document her grandfather sent, into the deeds of the trading company he had built over 40 years, into the ring he had worn on his right hand until the day he died, and which she had last seen on her father's finger at the funeral. N.F. Nathan Fenwick. Her hands began to shake, and she made herself count to 10 before she broke the seal. The envelope was not wages. It was a letter, folded 3 times, written in a clerk's careful hand on paper that had yellowed at the edges. At the top, in different handwriting, a heavier, slower hand that she recognized from the birthday letters that had arrived every year without fail until she was 18, were 6 words added after the fact, pressed so hard into the paper the pen had nearly gone through. "For my Arabella. Keep it safe." She read the clerk's letter twice before her knees gave way. Her grandfather had established a trust in 1807. Not for the estate. The estate had its own entailments, its own legal complications, its own path through 3 generations of Fenwick men. The trust was different. It had been set up at a private bank in London, under the name Fenwick Settlement, designated solely for the education and maintenance of the granddaughter of Sir Nathan Fenwick, to be administered upon her marriage or her 25th year, whichever came first. The principal was £40,000. It had been accruing interest for 19 years. Arabella sat on the floor of the north attic with the letter against her chest and understood three things at once. The first was that she was not poor. She had believed herself poor for 2 years. Since her father's death, since Bassett had stood in this very hall and told her the estate was entailed and that she would receive the contents of one room and her mother's jewelry and nothing else, she had believed him because she had been 22 years old and there had been no one to tell her otherwise. The second was that Bassett had known about the trust from the beginning. He was her father's solicitor. He had handled every document that passed through this house for 15 years. There was no version of the world in which a careful man had missed £40,000 and sitting in a London bank with her name on it. The third was that the Earl of Warwick had just handed her this letter without knowing what it was. He had been given it. Perhaps found among the estate papers when the house changed hands, perhaps slipped into an envelope by Bassett himself, who had judged it lost and no longer dangerous. He had thought it was wages. He had thought it was nothing. She did not go back into the hall. That was the first decision, and she made it sitting on the cold floor of a room with a badly drawing grate. And she made it not because she was strategic, but because she was afraid. If she walked down those stairs and laid the letter on the Earl's desk and said, "This is who I am," Bassett would be in that room before she finished speaking. And Bassett had 15 years of practiced answers and one overriding advantage. He had been trusted in this house longer than anyone could remember, and she had been hired as a seamstress in October. She wrapped the letter in a handkerchief. She tucked it inside her boot. Then she picked up her bag and walked out of Fenwick House through the kitchen door. The one door the footman didn't watch, and went down the road to the village. The inn was called the White Hart, and the woman who ran it was a Mrs. Price, 60 years old, with a sharp eye and the useful quality of not asking questions she wasn't going to like the answers to. She gave Arabella a room above the tap room for 2 shillings a week, and said nothing about the state of her boots. She got work at the draper's shop on the high street the following morning, hemming curtain lengths for 1 shilling a day. She had been hemming things since she was old enough to hold a needle, because her mother had believed in practical education, and her father had believed in his mother, and his mother had believed that idle hands were the first sign of a collapsing civilization. The village knew who she was within a week. She had not told anyone. She had introduced herself as Miss Graves and kept her head down and done the work, and it had made no difference because old Mr. Simons, who had been her grandfather's head groom and was now the Earl's head groom and would likely be head groom for whoever came after, recognized her on the second day at the shop. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, very quietly, "Miss Arabella." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Neither of them said another word. But after that, the village knew. They did not treat her with pity. That was the thing she hadn't expected. The draper's wife, a Mrs. Lennox, pressed a pot of soup into her hands at the end of the second week and said, "My sister worked in that house under your grandfather, and he was a fair man, and whatever that solicitor told you, you should have a lawyer look at it." The schoolmaster, a young man named Mr. Tolly who ran the one-room school in the church hall, told her he had 34 children and no one to take geography, and would she, on Thursdays. The blacksmith simply started walking behind her on the road back from the shop at dusk, without comment, until she reached the inn door and then turned around and went back. She taught geography on Thursdays. She learned things while she did it. She learned that the quarterly payments from the Fenwick estate to a London bank had been irregular since her father's illness, sometimes double, sometimes nothing at all, with no apparent pattern. She learned that Bassett had purchased a house in Bath the previous spring, at a price that surprised everyone who heard it. She learned that Mrs. Rowland had asked to see the estate accounts 3 times in the past year and been told 3 times that such papers were not for household staff. She learned all of this the way you learn things in a village, slowly, sideways, from the schoolmaster's wife and the woman at the post office, and a farmer who had once delivered hay to the house and overheard more than he was meant to. And she wrote it all down in a small notebook she kept in her boot alongside the letter. The Earl of Morwick came to the village on a Thursday. He had not intended to come. He had ridden out on estate business and taken the long way back and passed the church just as the children came spilling out of the hall in the late afternoon light. He pulled his horse up at the gate and watched them go, and then saw through the open door a woman at the blackboard with a piece of chalk in her hand. She was drawing the coastline of Canada. He could see the curve of it from where he sat. The Gulf of St. Lawrence rendered in chalked lines on a board too small for it. A girl of about 8 had her hand up and was speaking with great confidence about something, and the woman at the board was listening with her whole body tilted forward, chalk still raised, as if what the child was saying was the most interesting thing she had heard all week. Then the girl said something wrong, and the woman laughed. Properly, freely, the kind of laugh that isn't arranged for company, and crouched down to be on the child's level, and said something that made the girl laugh too. The Earl of Morwick sat on his horse in the lane, and looked at the woman who had been his seamstress, and thought, without meaning to, that he had dismissed her for going into the estate office to return a book she had been asked to return. It was an uncomfortable thought. He put it away. He was almost past the gate when she straightened and turned and saw him. She did not curtsy. She stood in the doorway of the church hall with chalk on her fingers and looked at him, and he found, to his considerable irritation, that he was the one who had to think of something to say. "You are teaching," he said. "I am," she said. "I was told you had no family connections in the county." "I did not say so, Mr. Bassett did." He looked at her. She looked at him. There was something in the quality of that look, steady, unhurried, not hostile, that he did not have a name for. He turned his horse and rode back to Fenwick House, and did not say a word to Bassett that evening, though Bassett came to the library at 9 with a decanter and a proposal about a widow in Salisbury with a comfortable income and a great deal of sense. He said nothing, but he went to the estate office the following morning before Bassett arrived and opened the account books himself for the first time since he had owned the house. He was not a man of figures. He had never claimed to be. He had hired Bassett on the recommendation of 2 men whose opinions he respected, and he had signed what Bassett put in front of him because Bassett had 15 years of experience, and because reading quarterly accounts had not seemed urgently necessary when there were farms to manage and tenants to see, and a roof on the east wing that had been failing since before he bought the property. He sat with the accounts for 2 hours. He could not have said exactly what he was looking for, but at the end of 2 hours he had found 3 payments made to a private account that had no corresponding entry in the estate ledger, and a quarterly disbursement listed simply as settlement with no further description, and tucked inside the back cover of the second ledger, a folded page in a hand he did not recognize that listed, in plain columns, exactly where 7 years of estate income had actually gone. It was not a small sum. He was still sitting at the desk when Mrs. Rowland came to find him. She stood in the doorway without knocking, which was not a thing housekeepers did, and she told him what she had been trying to tell someone for 3 years. She told him about the trust, not the details. She didn't have the details. only that old Sir Nathan had established something for his granddaughter before he died, and that Bassett had been the one to read the will, and that the granddaughter had been sent away from this house with her mother's jewelry and the contents of one room, and that a document sealed with a ship and 2 initials had been found among the estate papers when the house changed hands, and given to Bassett, who had said he would see it forwarded to the proper party. "He gave it to me," said the Earl, "as wages, when I dismissed her." Mrs. Rowland's expression did not change. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I thought perhaps he had." The Earl was quiet for a count of perhaps 20. Then he stood up and put the hidden page into his coat and walked to the stable. He found Arabella at the draper's shop. She did not look surprised to see him. He was beginning to think she was not easily surprised. "The trust," he said, when they were standing in the back room with the bolts of fabric and no one else present. "You knew." "I found out 6 weeks after I came back to this house," she said. "I came back because I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what it was until I found the ledgers. You came back as a seamstress. You wouldn't have let me in as myself." That was true, and they both knew it, and he did not pretend otherwise. "Bassett has been collecting the trust payments," he said. "The quarterly disbursements in the London account, drawing on them for at least 4 years. "I know," she said. "I have the figures in my notebook. I need that notebook." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Your Grace, if I give you that notebook, what happens to Bassett?" "He is arrested. And if I give you that notebook and you decide, on reflection, that a seamstress who entered your house under a false name is more convenient to blame than a solicitor you've trusted for 9 months. That is not going to happen. You will forgive me," she said, "if I'd like to be somewhat more certain than your word before I hand you the only evidence I have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would make you certain?" She thought about it the way she had thought about everything in the past 2 months, carefully, without sentiment, turning the problem over until she could see all its faces. "Tell Mrs. Rowland what you found in the accounts," she said, "today, in front of the whole household. Tell them before Bassett has a chance to speak first." He did. He rode back to Fenwick House and called the household into the great hall and stood in the same spot where he had stood when he had dismissed Miss Graves, when he had dismissed Arabella Fenwick from her own family's house, and he told them what he had found, all of it, the hidden page, the private account, the trust that had been draining into a solicitor's pocket for 4 years, while the woman it belonged to hemmed curtains in the village for a shilling a day. Bassett was not in the house. He had gone to the magistrate that morning, whether he had heard something or simply read the direction of the wind, and sworn an information himself. Theft of estate property, a seamstress who had insinuated herself into the household under false pretenses. The magistrate was a Sir Graham Prout, 68 years old, and deeply uninterested in being presented with competing sworn statements on a Thursday afternoon. He looked at Bassett's information. He looked at the Earl's evidence, the hidden page, the account discrepancies, the trust documents. He looked at the notebook, which Arabella had sent up with old Simon's that morning, before the Earl ever reached the village, because she had made the decision the night before and had not slept well, but had not changed her mind. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he said, in a very dry voice, that in 40 years on the bench he had never seen a solicitor who couldn't account for money he had handled, and that in his experience there were only 2 explanations for that, and one of them didn't end with a pension. Bassett was taken before supper. Arabella walked up the hill to Fenwick House at dusk. She had not been asked to come. She came because the house was hers, had always been hers, in every way that mattered, and because there were things that needed to be said in person, and she was tired of saying them in notebooks. The Earl met her in the hall. He looked worse than he had that morning, the particular look of a man who has been sitting with a discomfort he cannot put down. She recognized it because she had worn it herself for 2 solid years. "The trust is intact," he said. "The bank's man in London says Bassett drew on it selectively. Left the principal untouched because the principal would have triggered an audit. The interest comes to $11,200. I know," she said. "He sent me a wire this afternoon. The estate is not in the position I was led to believe when I purchased it. There are mortgages I was not shown." He stopped. "I won't pretend this house is as straightforward as it looked in March." "It never was," she said. "My father bought it from his own debts for 20 years. Bassett helped him do it." The Earl looked at her. "I dismissed you in front of 8 people. I handed you an envelope given to me by the man who was robbing you and told you there was a coaching inn in the village." "Yes," she said. "I should like to say something about that." "I would rather you didn't," said Arabella. "Not tonight." She looked around the hall, the stone floor, the high ceiling, the portraits of Fenwick men looking down with expressions of permanent mild disapproval. "Tonight I should like to see if Mrs. Rowland will make tea, and then I should like to look at the actual state of the accounts, if you're willing, because I have been looking at pieces of them for 2 months, and I would like to see the whole thing." They sat in the library until midnight. Mrs. Rowland brought tea twice. The second time, she set the tray down and looked at the 2 of them. The Earl with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, Arabella with a pencil behind her ear and 3 ledgers open in front of her, and went back to the kitchen without a word. She was heard to say to the cook, later, in a voice that carried further than she intended, that she had worked in that house for 27 years and had never once heard an argument about timber leases that sounded underneath like something else entirely. The accounts were bad. They were not impossible. "The North Farms have been underlet for 6 years, said Arabella at 10:30. "Not because there's no money in them. Because Bassett told your predecessor there wasn't." "How do you know that?" "Mr. Simons. He has been here longer than anyone." The Earl looked at the figure she had written in the margin. "That's recoverable." "Yes, if someone manages it properly." She set down the pencil. "I'm not coming back as your seamstress. I want to be very clear about that. I wouldn't ask you to. But I have an interest in what happens to this house," she said. "My grandfather built it. The people in this village have lived under its shadow for 3 generations. I'm not willing to let it collapse because its current owner was handed false accounts in March and hasn't had time to find the real ones." She looked at him. "If you're willing to open the books, properly, every quarter, with an independent auditor, I will work with you to get the North Farms back to what they should be. Not as a charity, as a business arrangement." The Earl of Warwick was quiet for a moment. "You came back to this house with a needle and a false name to find out what had been done to your family, and now you're offering to help me fix it." "I'm offering to help fix the part that affects 200 people who live on this land," she said. "You happen to come with it." He looked at her. She looked back the same way she had looked at him from the schoolhouse doorway. Steady, patient, not hostile. There was something in that quality, he thought, that was going to take him a very long time to understand. He found he did not object to that. "There is one condition," she said. "Name it." "The school gets a proper building, not the church hall. A building with windows that close and a floor that doesn't flood in April. Before anything else. Before the North Farms, before the East Wing roof, before anything." "Done," he said. She picked up her pencil. "Then let's start with the timber leases, because whoever agreed to those terms was either very trusting or very stupid, and I suspect I know which. The school was finished by the following spring, a solid building at the edge of the churchyard, with 4 windows that closed properly and a floor that did not flood. There were 38 children in it. Mr. Tolley taught on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Arabella taught on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on alternate Saturdays, geography, which she considered underprovided for in the average education, and saw no reason why an English village should be different on the point. The older children still called her Miss Graves, because that was what they had started with. She never corrected them. The Earl corrected them once, at the gate, in the spring. She looked at him sharply, and he looked back at her with an expression she had learned over the winter to read quite accurately. "They'll sort it out," she said, and walked through the gate, and after a moment he followed her. There is a small framed piece on the wall of the school now, in the place where such schools usually put improving quotations about knowledge or virtue. It is a piece of paper, very old, slightly yellowed at the edges, enclosed in plain glass. The handwriting is not a clerk's. It is heavier, slower, the writing of someone who learned it late and pressed too hard. "For my Arabella, keep it safe." The children always ask what it means. She tells them it is a letter from someone who ran out of time to say what he meant in person, and that the lesson is not to wait.